What if the reason you can't seem to fix a strained relationship isn't because you're using the wrong communication tools, but because you just fundamentally misunderstand what you're looking at? I mean, what if you're walking around thinking you're trying to fix a broken machine, when in reality you're trying to navigate your way through this massive, sprawling, highly defended foreign city?
That completely changes the required skill set, right? I mean, if
Oh.
you're fixing a machine, you really just need a manual and a wrench. But if you're navigating a foreign city, you need a map, a translator, a sense of the local history, and just a whole lot of situational awareness. You can't just, open up a city and swap out a gear.
Exactly. And that shift moving from viewing people as mechanical problems to be solved to viewing them as complex landscapes to be explored is really the beating heart of our deep dive today.
It's a huge perspective shift.
It really is. We're exploring this fascinating excerpt. It's titled Relational Topology Part V, The Coherent City. This was put out by the Spectrix Metaphysical Institute, authored by Carlton Doxey Johnson, PhD, and was actually developed alongside OpenAI.
Right, which gives it this really unique analytical depth.
Yeah, and if you're coming into this deep dive expecting standard networking advice, the 5 tricks to make your boss like you or how to win every argument, you really need to leave that at the door.
Yeah, because that traditional advice almost universally treats human connection as a transaction. It's about behavioral economics. It's about managing people, leveraging them, or, optimizing them for your own ends. It is very much that machine view of humanity that you were just talking about.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this source throws all of that out the window right from the jump. It doesn't start with conflict resolution. It starts with this massive existential question.
It really pulls back the lens.
Right. It points out that as we go through life, we spend all our time asking these logistical questions, right? Like, where am I in my career, or where am I going in 5 years? But eventually, if we're paying attention, we hit this much quieter, deeper wall.
We have to ask the bigger thing.
Exactly. We are forced to ask, why was I ever connected to anyone at all?
Which is just a profound reset. It completely bypasses the entire modern obsession with relationship logistics and goes straight to the root of human existence. Why is the fabric of reality woven this way?
Yeah.
And the framework answers this by completely dismantling our assumptions about what relationships are actually for. I mean, we generally assume the finish line of a relationship is understanding. We think, if my partner just understood me, everything would be fine.
Right. We treat being understood like it's the ultimate grand prize of existence. Like, if I get that, I win.
We do. But this framework argues that understanding is barely the lobby of the building. Understanding is literally just the doorway. The actual destination, the reason we are connected at all, is transformation. It uses these really heavy words like communion, participation, and shared becoming.
Shared becoming. That phrasing is incredible. It implies that when I sit down across from someone, I am not a finished product interacting with another finished product.
Not at all.
We're both fluid. We are actively, structurally altering what the other person is turning into just by being in proximity to them.
Think about the mechanics of that for a second. I mean, if the goal is just understanding, you can achieve that from a distance, right?
Sure, yeah.
You can read a biography of Abraham Lincoln and understand him perfectly without ever interacting with him. You're safely observing a static structure.
Because he's not going to change you, and you're not going to change him.
Exactly. But shared becoming means you are stepping onto the construction site, you're mixing the mortar, you're lifting the bricks, you're allowing your own architecture to be altered by the presence of another human being. And that is inherently dangerous, and it is inherently creative.
But that raises a massive question for me. If shared becoming is so difficult, and frankly so risky, why on earth are we wired to need it?
That's the big biological question.
Right. Like, if transformation is the goal, why couldn't the universe just design us to transform all by ourselves? Why couldn't we just be entirely self-sufficient, completely independent little islands of existence?
Well, the short answer is that the universe just doesn't do independent islands.
It really doesn't.
No, and the longer answer takes us into the biological and cosmic foundations of this entire philosophy. We have to look at the concept of The Plex.
The Plex. This is a really core idea in the text, right?
Yes, very core. The Plex is the foundational reality that no living system exists alone. It's this undeniable interconnectivity of all things. The text argues we were never built to exist alone because nothing meaningful in the known universe exists in complete isolation.
Right.
And the framework scales this up perfectly, starting at the absolute microscopic level. It reminds us that cells become tissues.
Okay, let's actually linger on that biology for a second.
Yeah.
Because we hear cells become tissues, and we just nod like it's a boring middle school science fact.
Right, like, yeah, mitochondria is the powerhouse, whatever.
Exactly. But the mechanism of how that happens is wild.
It's miraculous, really. A single cell is this marvel of self-containment. It has its own energy production, its own boundary, its own genetic code.
It's doing its own thing.
Yeah, but a single cell is profoundly limited. It can only do so much. In order to become a tissue, that cell has to make a fundamental compromise. It has to open its membrane.
Which is a risk.
A huge risk. It has to start sending and receiving chemical signals to the cells next to it. It literally has to synchronize its internal functions with a neighbor it doesn't control.
It's giving up a degree of absolute sovereignty in exchange for capability. Like, it can't contract and move a limb all by itself, but if it binds to a billion other muscle cells, suddenly it can run.
Exactly. And then those tissues, through further connection and ordered diversity, they aggregate into organs. The organs aggregate into living bodies.
And it scales up to us.
Right. Individuals aggregate into families, families into communities, communities into civilizations. The underlying mechanism here is that life organizes itself. It doesn't aggregate randomly, it aggregates coherently.
And it scales all the way up. The framework doesn't stop at human civilization. It points out that gravity pulls matter together to form stars, and gravity pulls stars together to form galaxies.
That cosmic scale is vital to the argument. It forces us to realize that the human drive to connect isn't just some evolutionary quirk or like a psychological weakness.
It's not a flaw.
No, it is the literal physics of the universe operating within us. Resisting connection is like trying to resist gravity.
Okay, I have to push back here, because I hear the gravity argument and I hear the cellular biology argument. But let's look at the actual culture we live in today.
Oh yeah, it's the total opposite.
Right. We live in a society that actively glorifies the exact opposite of this. We worship the self-made billionaire. We idolize the hyper-independent lone wolf. The prevailing cultural narrative right now, especially online, is, I don't need anyone, I protect my own peace. If someone brings me bad vibes, I just cut them off. Total self-sufficiency is marketed to us as the ultimate form of self-care.
That is incredibly true, and it highlights this massive tension. We are biologically wired for the Plex, for total interconnection, but we are culturally conditioned for isolation.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Now, to be fair to that cultural instinct, the framework does provide a caveat. It explicitly acknowledges that isolation can protect us for a season.
A season of protection. That actually makes sense from a trauma perspective.
Absolutely. Think about the physiological mechanism of a physical injury. When you sprain your ankle, your body immediately floods the area with fluid. It swells up.
It gets inflamed.
Right. That inflammation is literally a form of biological isolation. It stiffens the joint to prevent further movement, and it creates a barrier against infection. It is a necessary, highly effective triage response.
So when people go through emotional trauma, like a brutal divorce or a toxic workplace or a profound betrayal, pulling back and isolating themselves is just emotional inflammation. It's triage.
It is entirely necessary for survival in that moment. You pull up the drawbridge to stop the bleeding. The danger and the point this framework is really pressing on is that you cannot leave the drawbridge up forever.
Because you get stuck.
Right. Inflammation is meant to be temporary. If a joint stays inflamed for years, the tissue actually begins to die. The joint freezes permanently.
Becomes a disease.
Precisely. If a cell decides to completely isolate itself, stop communicating, and build an impenetrable wall against the surrounding tissue, that is the literal biological definition of a tumor.
Wow.
A healthy organism is constantly in a state of coherent connection, constantly exchanging resources.
So when we use isolation as a season of protection, it's a lifesaver. But when that season goes on for 10 years, we aren't protecting ourselves anymore. We were starving ourselves.
We're cutting off our own supply lines.
Exactly. The war might have ended 5 years ago, but we're still living in the bunker, eating canned rations, terrified of the surface. We are fighting the gravity of our own nature.
And that realization is terrifying for a lot of people, because once you accept that you absolutely must leave the bunker, that you have to connect with other human beings to flourish, you are immediately faced with the reality that other human beings are incredibly messy, unpredictable, and dangerous.
Which brings us to the core metaphor of this entire deep dive. If we have to connect, how do we view the people we are connecting with?
This is where it gets really visual.
Yeah, this is where the framework introduces the concept of the invisible cities. This is honestly one of the most stunning visualizations of human complexity I've ever encountered.
It fundamentally changes the topology of how we relate. The premise is this. When you meet another human being, you are not merely meeting a personality. You are encountering an entire, sprawling, invisible city.
I really want to break down exactly what this means, because the word personality gets thrown around so casually today.
It's very reductive. It's so reductive. We reduce people to these tiny little avatars. Oh, Sarah from accounting is an introvert. Dave is a type A driver. We slap a Myers-Briggs label or an Enneagram number on someone and we think, great, I've got you figured out. I know exactly what you are.
Which is absurd if you think about it. That is the equivalent of looking at a city's skyline from an airplane at 30,000 feet and claiming you know exactly what it feels like to live in the downtown district.
Right, like I saw the Sears Tower, I know Chicago.
Exactly. A personality is just the facade. It's the architecture that is visible to the public. It's how a person has learned to present themselves to survive the day. But the framework urges us to recognize that behind that skyline are vast, intricate internal structures.
The framework calls it the city within, and it specifically lists the components of these inner cities. It says they are built out of dreams, failures, personal history, profound joy, devastating loss, hope, and fear. Let's apply this mechanically to a real-world interaction. Imagine you have a new boss, and this person is incredibly rigid. They micromanage every detail, they snap at the slightest deviation from the plan, and they just seem obsessed with control.
We've all had that boss.
Right. And the easy, traditional approach is to label their personality. You say, my boss is a toxic control freak. You judge the skyline.
But if we apply the city within concept, we have to assume there is an invisible neighborhood driving that behavior.
Exactly. You have to intellectually step into their city. Why is that specific defense mechanism built so high? Perhaps somewhere in the unmapped neighborhoods of their history, there is an early childhood trauma built on unpredictability.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Maybe they grew up in a household where chaos was the norm, and the only way they survived was by obsessively controlling their immediate environment. That neighborhood of fear is still heavily populated in their mind.
Or maybe earlier in their career, they trusted a team member who made a catastrophic mistake that almost ruined their life. So they built this massive fortress of micromanagement over the ruins of that betrayal. The point is, we have absolutely no idea what roads they've traveled.
We don't. Every person carries neighborhoods we have never walked, and monuments to past joys we cannot see. And what's fascinating here is how this specific structural metaphor entirely rewires the mechanics of human compassion.
I was just going to say that, because compassion in our culture usually just means pity. It means looking down at someone who is struggling and feeling this vague sense of sympathy, like, oh, poor them.
But pity is hierarchical. It assumes you are above the other person. The architectural framework states that true compassion is something altogether different. True compassion only begins when you fully realize the sheer scale of the invisible city inside the visible person in front of you.
It replaces pity with awe.
Precisely. Awe and reverence. It is the sudden, humbling realization that you are standing at the outer gates of a complex, living history that you do not fully understand. You are an absolute foreigner in their internal landscape.
Think about how you act when you actually visit a foreign city. Say I drop you in the middle of Tokyo. You don't speak the language. You don't know the transit system. You don't know the cultural etiquette. Do you just start sprinting through the streets, screaming your opinions and telling everyone they're doing everything wrong?
No, you would be incredibly careful. You would observe. You would ask for directions. You would be hyper-aware of your own ignorance.
Right. You approach with respect because you acknowledge the complexity of the environment. But we rarely do this with human beings.
Almost never.
Have a 5-minute conversation with a barista who seems a little short with us, or a family member at Thanksgiving who makes a passive-aggressive comment, and we instantly judge their entire metropolis based on standing in their emotional airport terminal for 5 minutes.
Which is why the framework gives a very specific operational directive when dealing with the invisible cities of others. It demands that we approach gently.
Approach gently.
Yeah.
Because you have no idea if the conversational road you are walking on inside their mind is paved with solid concrete, or if it's built over a sinkhole of fragile glass.
Exactly. Approaching gently means shifting from a posture of assumption to a posture of curiosity. It means leaving space for their unseen history to contextualize their current behavior.
And it doesn't mean you let them walk all over you.
No, of course not. You don't have to excuse toxic behavior, but approaching gently means you recognize that the behavior is likely a structural defense mechanism protecting a much deeper, hidden vulnerability.
Okay, I love this conceptually, but practically I have a major problem with it.
Lay it on me.
If I have my own messy, highly defended invisible city, well, wait, I shouldn't say invisible city like it's a monolith. If I have my own sprawling metropolis and you have yours and my neighbor has theirs and my boss has theirs, if everyone is a complex city filled with inflicting neighborhoods of trauma and joy, how on earth does this not end in complete disaster?
You're asking the zoning question.
Yes, it sounds like an absolute zoning nightmare. If we are biologically forced to connect, but we are all structurally vastly different, isn't putting all these cities together just a recipe for endless war and bulldozing each other? How do we find any harmony when everyone's architecture clashes?
This is where the framework introduces a concept called relational topology, and specifically the principle that solves your zoning nightmare. It says, coherence is greater than agreement.
Coherence is greater than agreement. We have to dissect this because I think most people believe that the only way to have a functional society or even a functional marriage is total agreement. We think harmony equals sameness.
It's the great modern fallacy. We expend unbelievable amounts of emotional energy trying to force everyone around us to adopt our exact blueprints.
We really do.
We want our spouses to process emotions exactly the way we do. We want our coworkers to prioritize tasks exactly the way we do. We curate our social media feeds so we only see political opinions that exactly match our own. We think safety is found in uniformity.
But the framework says harmony isn't sameness. And it gives these incredibly sharp analogies to prove it. It says, an orchestra doesn't consist of violins alone.
Let's look at the physics of an orchestra. If an orchestra was based on the principle of agreement of total sameness, you would have 100 people all playing the exact same note on 100 identical violins.
It would be loud, but it would be completely flat. There's no depth.
There is no resonance. To create actual symphonic harmony, you need instruments that are fundamentally structurally different from one another. A tuba is not a violin. It operates on entirely different physics. It requires massive amounts of air to produce deep, slow, booming frequencies. A violin is all about highly tense strings producing sharp, rapid, high frequencies. They do not agree on how to make sound.
And if the violin tries to force the tuba to act like a violin, you literally destroy the tuba.
Exactly. Coherence is the realization that the high notes of the violin actually require the deep, grounding foundation of the tuba to give the music emotional weight. The differences don't compete, they integrate.
The framework gives other examples too. It says, cities don't consist only of hospitals.
Right. A hospital is a vital, noble institution. It heals the sick. But if every single building in a city is a hospital, the city dies.
Because who is generating the electricity?
Exactly. Who is growing the food? Who is collecting the garbage? The city requires a power plant, a farm, and a sanitation department. Those structures serve entirely different, sometimes completely unglamorous purposes, but without them, the hospital cannot function.
I've actually seen this happen in corporate environments. The text mentions, organizations don't consist only of visionaries. I once worked for a tech startup that only hired idea people. Everyone's a visionary. Everyone was looking 5 years into the future, drawing on whiteboards, coming up with brilliant disruptive paradigms.
Oh no. And what happened?
It collapsed in 6 months because nobody wanted to do the accounting. Nobody wanted to write the actual lines of code or deal with HR compliance. There was massive agreement. They all agreed on the vision, but there was zero coherence because there was no diversity of function.
That is the definition of relational topology. It is finding the proper positioning of different structures so they can integrate. The framework defines this as ordered diversity. Coherence means difference working together without destroying one another.
Without destroying one another. That is the key, right? Because my pushback earlier was about the messy reality of fundamental disagreements. Let's say you have two people in a relationship who have vastly different invisible cities. Yeah. One is a highly structured, risk-averse hospital, and the other is a chaotic, risk-taking amusement park.
Right, a classic pairing.
How do they achieve coherence without one trying to pave over the other?
It requires an intentional shift from assimilation to integration.
Okay, unpack that.
Assimilation is when the hospital looks at the amusement park and says, you need to become a hospital too, because that's the only valid way to exist. Integration is when the hospital says, I am going to handle our financial security and structural safety, and I need you to handle our capacity for joy, spontaneity, and stress relief.
You stop trying to convert them, and you start utilizing the friction between your differences as the actual engine of the relationship.
Exactly. You realize that you don't need everyone in your life to agree with your internal architecture. You just need to figure out where their architecture safely fits into the broader ecosystem of your life.
When we manage our daily lives, this is so incredibly freeing. Think about the amount of stress you carry trying to argue your parents or your siblings or your colleagues into agreeing with your worldview.
It's exhausting.
It is. But if you internalize this concept, you can look at a family member who votes differently than you or processes trauma differently than you, and instead of screaming at them to change their blueprints, you ask, how can our differences exist in the same ecosystem without burning the ecosystem down?
It lowers the stakes of every disagreement. You aren't fighting for existential validation anymore. You are just negotiating city zoning.
Okay, this is brilliant theory. But this is where the rubber meets the road. If I have an invisible city and I need to build this ordered diversity with the incredibly frustrating invisible cities around me, how do I actually do the construction? How do I build coherence on a random Tuesday when I'm exhausted, the emails are piling up, and someone just cut me off in traffic?
You're asking about the actual mechanics of daily relational construction, and the framework addresses this directly. It tells us that becoming an architect of coherence doesn't happen in sweeping cinematic moments of grand revelation.
Right.
It happens in the microscopic, highly unglamorous friction of ordinary life.
It says the daily rituals of invisible construction look deeply ordinary. We are laying building stones. Let's pull 3 specific practical ways to build coherence straight from the text and really dissect the psychology of how they work. The first building stone is listening before speaking.
If we keep the architectural metaphor, listening before speaking is the absolute necessity of surveying the land before you pour the foundation.
Let's talk about why we don't do this. Biologically, when we are in a stressful conversation, our brain is usually racing to formulate our next counter-argument while the other person is still talking.
That's the ego trying to protect its own architecture. When you speak before you listen, you are essentially backing up a cement truck and pouring concrete blindly onto a site you haven't mapped.
Which is a disaster waiting to happen.
Completely. You might be pouring your brilliant advice right on top of a fragile neighborhood of grief that you didn't bother to locate first. You might be building a massive wall where a doorway was desperately needed.
So listening, true active listening, is the exploratory drilling. It's sending a probe into the other person's city to figure out what is the structural integrity of this conversation right now. Are they capable of hearing a hard truth, or do they just need an emotional harbor today?
Exactly. Listening establishes the topological map. Without it, you're building in the dark.
Building stone number 2, keeping promises.
Let's look at the neurology of trust for a second. The human brain is essentially a prediction machine. It constantly analyzes past patterns to predict future outcomes so we can feel safe.
Right.
When you make a promise to someone, you are installing a load-bearing pillar in their mind. You are saying, you can build your psychological expectations on top of this event happening.
I will pick you up at 5 p.m. I will not share this secret. I will have this report done by Friday.
When you follow through, you reinforce that pillar. The brain registers the structure as sound and trust deepens. But when you break a promise, even a small one, that pillar crumbles, and whatever emotional security they had built on top of it collapses.
And the damage isn't just about the specific thing you failed to do. It undermines the structural integrity of the entire relationship. If the pillar in the kitchen collapses, you don't really trust the floor in the living room anymore either.
Precisely. Keeping small promises is the unsexy daily mortar work of proving that your architecture won't collapse under the weight of their vulnerability.
The third building stone is where things get really challenging, especially in our current culture.
Yeah.
It's repairing before replacing.
We live in a highly disposable society. Planned obsolescence isn't just for smartphones anymore. We've applied it to human beings.
We really have. If a toaster stops working perfectly, you throw it in the trash and buy a new one on Amazon. And when a relationship experiences structural strain, when a friend disappoints us or a community member acts out, the cultural impulse is to cancel them, cut them off, replace them.
Just find a new friend group. Start over. But the framework demands that an architect of coherence looks at a broken bridge and asks, how can we reinforce this? Instead of immediately reaching for the dynamite.
And it gives very specific, actionable examples of what repairing a broken bridge in a community actually looks like.
Correct.
It is a highly delicate operation. For instance, it says we must choose to correct without humiliating.
I want to spend some time on this because the psychological difference between correction and humiliation is the exact difference between construction and destruction.
Absolutely. When you correct someone, let's say an employee makes a significant error in a presentation, or your partner makes a financial mistake, you are pointing out a structural flaw. You are saying, this beam is compromised, it won't hold the weight of reality. That feedback is necessary for the survival of the system.
But how you deliver that feedback determines everything.
Right.
If you correct them with humiliation, if you mock their intelligence, if you dress them down in front of their colleagues, if you use a tone of absolute contempt, you are no longer just pointing out a bad beam, you are dropping an incendiary bomb on their city square.
And biologically, when a human being feels the emotion of shame or humiliation, the amygdala fires up and completely hijacks the brain. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for logic, learning, and structural repair, literally shuts down.
The city gates slam shut. They go into total defense mode. The psychological mechanism of humiliation ensures that absolutely no learning can take place. They aren't thinking about the mistake anymore. They are just trying to survive the assault on their identity.
So correcting without humiliating means addressing the behavior without attacking the core architecture of the person. It's precision structural repair. It's saying, the math on this spreadsheet is wrong, let's fix it. Instead of saying, you are terrible at your job, one fixes a beam, the other poisons the water supply.
The framework also mentions choosing to forgive to strengthen a beam. Forgiveness is often framed as a weak, passive surrender.
Like you're just letting them get away with it.
Right. But architecturally, forgiveness is an active, heavy-duty repair. When someone betrays you, a fracture appears in the relationship. If you ignore it, the building eventually falls. If you forgive, you are actively injecting epoxy into the crack, reinforcing the weak point so it can bear the weight of future interactions.
And then there's teaching without controlling.
This is the difference between handing someone blueprints and trying to micromanage their construction site. If you are mentoring someone or parenting a child, you have to impart wisdom, the blueprints, but eventually you have to step back and let them pour the concrete themselves.
Or otherwise, they never learn how to build.
Exactly. If you control them, you stunt their internal city-building capabilities. They become entirely dependent on your scaffolding.
These daily rituals are the literal building blocks of emotional growth. The framework actually uses a sequence of metaphors that just perfectly visualizes how this works in real time. It says, every word lays a brick.
Yeah.
Every act of forgiveness strengthens a beam. Every kindness opens a window. Every betrayal creates a fracture. And every encouragement plants a garden.
What is so sobering about that list is the relentless, inescapable nature of it. The framework reminds us that every single life is constantly under construction, which means, whether you are paying attention or not, you are always building something.
There is no neutral interaction. Even your silence is building something. If your partner asks you a vulnerable question and you just stare at your phone in silence, you didn't do nothing. You just laid a massive, heavy brick of rejection. You built a wall.
And over years, those tiny micro-interactions, the thousands of bricks laid in passing aggregate into the massive structures that define our lives, this is a point the framework emphasizes beautifully. It says great cities and great communities are rarely built through spectacular cinematic moments. They are built through faithful ones.
Faithful ones. It's the daily discipline of the mundane. A thriving marriage isn't built on the 1-2-week vacation to Paris. It's built on the 10,000 times you chose to speak gently when you were both exhausted on a Tuesday night. It's the 10,000 times you chose to correct without humiliating.
Those unglamorous, faithful moments are the invisible mortar that holds the entire visible world together.
But this brings us to a really fascinating pivot point in the philosophy. If we are laying these bricks every single day, if every action is contributing to this invisible architecture, what is the ultimate structure we are leaving behind? When our life is over, what remains?
This shifts us directly into the framework's exploration of legacy.
It really forces a redefinition of inheritance. When we ask the classic question, what will I leave behind when I'm gone? Modern society hands us a very predictable, very tangible menu of options.
And the menu is always buildings, books, bank accounts, businesses. We are told that legacy means putting your name on a hospital wing, or building a unicorn tech startup, or writing a New York Times bestseller. It's all about visible monuments to the self.
And while the framework doesn't condemn those things, tangible achievements have value, it argues that there is a deeper, infinitely more enduring form of inheritance. It argues that true legacy is architectural, but in the relational sense.
It says true inheritance is the cities you strengthened, the bridges you repaired, the harbors you protected, the gates you guarded with wisdom, the gardens you cultivated.
Let's actually dig into the psychology of these specific structural metaphors, because this is how we translate the abstract idea of legacy into actual daily transformation. Let's start with the bridges you repaired. We discussed the mechanics of repair earlier, but apply this to the scale of a lifetime.
Think about the legacy of being the mediator in a fractured family system. Long after you are gone, two entire branches of a family tree might remain connected simply because, 30 years ago, you did the agonizing, unglamorous work of repairing a bridge of communication between two warring siblings. You don't get a plaque for that.
But the structural integrity of that family lineage survives because of your invisible labor. And what about the harbors you protected?
A harbor, structurally, is a place of refuge from chaotic, violent waters. It is where ships go when they are too damaged to survive the open ocean. Psychologically, think about the people who have acted as harbors in your own life. When you were going through the darkest crisis, a sudden job loss, a devastating medical diagnosis, a divorce, whose door did you knock on?
Whose invisible city felt inherently safe enough to anchor in while the storm passed?
You know exactly who those people are instantly. You feel their safety in your nervous system.
Exactly. Becoming that harbor for others, creating an environment of profound psychological safety where weary people can drop anchor and repair their own ships, is a monumental legacy.
It is.
Then there's the gates you guarded with wisdom. I love this one because gates control access. This is about boundaries. This is the legacy of the cycle breaker.
Yes. The person who looks at generations of toxic family patterns, alcoholism, abuse, or chronic manipulation, and finally stands at the gate and says, "No further. This stops with me. I am closing the gate to this poison." They guard the internal coherence of the city by refusing to let destructive elements enter.
And the gardens you cultivated. Gardens aren't natural, right? They require intentional design, constant feeding, and weeding. This is the legacy of mentorship. It's the teacher who saw potential in a struggling student and watered it for years.
All of these metaphors point to a radical, fundamental shift in how we view our relationship to the world. And it hinges on one specific word in the framework. It suggests that legacy is less about ownership and entirely about stewardship.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's break down the psychology of ownership versus stewardship because they lead to entirely different lives. Ownership is inherently ego-driven. It's the belief that I am the main character and everyone else is just an asset in my portfolio.
Ownership says, I built this company, it belongs to me, I raised these children, they are mine. It creates a dynamic of control. If you believe you own a relationship, you will inevitably try to force the other person to conform to your needs.
But stewardship recognizes that you don't actually own anyone. You don't own your team at work, you don't own your spouse, you don't even own your children.
You are simply entrusted with their care for a limited period of time. An architect doesn't own the cathedral they design. They steward the vision, they oversee the construction, but the goal is to build something that will stand long after they are dead, so that future generations can find meaning inside it.
When we manage a team at work, it's so easy for us to fall into the ownership trap. We want the team to perform, so we get the promotion. But if you adopt a stewardship mindset, your metric of success completely flips. You start asking, am I repairing the bridges of communication on this team? Am I protecting the harbor of our culture from corporate toxicity? Am I cultivating the gardens of these junior employees' careers?
That shift from ownership to stewardship is the gateway to the final and most profound revelation in the entire framework. If we are constantly building and our legacy is the structural health of the communities we steward, what is the ultimate goal of human maturity? What does the fully actualized coherent city look like?
This is the part that genuinely stopped me in my tracks.
Yeah.
The framework says the wisest cities eventually forget themselves. They become places where others flourish.
Forgetting oneself. In an era defined by aggressive self-promotion, personal branding, and the endless curation of our own digital skylines, the idea of intentionally forgetting yourself sounds almost like madness.
It really does. But it defines this as the apex of human development. It's the movement away from being concerned with being admired toward a deep, overriding concern with becoming useful.
Let's dissect the difference between being admired and being useful. When your primary psychological drive is to be admired, your entire life becomes an exhausting public relations campaign for your ego. You spend all your energy polishing the visible facade of your personality.
You want people to look at your LinkedIn profile or your perfect family photos on Instagram or your witty takes on Twitter and say, wow, what a beautiful city. They have it all together.
It is an entirely aesthetic existence. But functionally, behind that polished skyline, the internal infrastructure might be completely rotting. You might be deeply lonely, highly anxious, and relationally bankrupt. Being admired does not require structural integrity.
But when you shift your desire toward becoming useful, you stop caring so much about the paint job on the skyline, and you start obsessing over the plumbing. You start focusing on the roads, the power grid, the unseen support systems.
Because utility requires infrastructure. A useful city is one that can support the weight of other people's lives. It is a place where businesses can grow, where children can be raised safely, where innovation can happen. You aren't building a monument to yourself anymore. You are building an ecosystem for others.
To help us measure this shift, the framework provides 3 incredible questions to evaluate our own relational legacy. It warns us not to ask the standard ego question: how many people know my name?
Because fame is just a billboard. It has zero structural value.
Exactly. Instead, it challenges us to ask, number 1, how many people discovered hope because our paths crossed?
That is a metric of genuine utility. Did your presence in their life act as a structural reinforcement when their own architecture was failing?
And number 2, what kind of city will remain when we're gone? Will it be a fortress of isolation or an open harbor?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it brings all the core concepts of the text together perfectly. We started with the city within, which taught us the necessity of governing our own complex internal neighborhoods. We explored the Plex, which revealed the inescapable biological and cosmic reality of our interconnectedness. And we navigated relational topology, which showed us how to position ourselves within these living systems through coherence rather than agreement.
And the text explicitly states that all of these frameworks were quietly pointing to one singular, absolute truth. We were never created simply to build monuments to ourselves. We were created to become places where life can flourish.
To become places. That phrasing represents a massive locus of control shift.
A locus of control shift. Explain how that works psychologically.
Well, think about how most of us operate. We have an external locus of control when it comes to relationships. We spend massive amounts of energy agonizing over our environment. We ask, who belongs in my life? Where is my tribe? Why can't I find the right partner? Why is my workplace so toxic?
It's a consumer mindset. We are walking through the mall of humanity, shopping for the perfect people to furnish our lives, and getting incredibly frustrated when the furniture doesn't fit our exact specifications.
Exactly. We are trying to manipulate the external topology to force it to meet our needs. But the framework says you can stop asking who belongs in your life. That is the wrong question entirely. The deeper, much more powerful question is, what kind of person must I become so that wherever I am placed, life becomes more coherent because I was there?
That puts the responsibility entirely back on me. I can't control if my boss is a toxic micromanager. I can't control if a global pandemic strains my community. But I can control the internal architecture of my own city.
You take absolute responsibility for your invisible construction. You focus on becoming a person of deep integrity, a bridge of empathetic understanding, a secure harbor of peace. And the profound promise of this framework is that when you change your internal architecture, your external topology begins to change naturally.
Why does that happen naturally?
Because healthy people recognize healthy architecture. Purpose recognizes purpose. If you do the exhausting, unglamorous work of building a genuinely safe harbor, you don't need to put up neon signs advertising it. You don't need to manipulate people into anchoring there.
People who are battered by the storms of life will naturally navigate toward safety.
They will. The frantic, exhausting search for belonging finally ends, not because you stumbled upon a magical utopia where everyone perfectly agrees with you, but because you transformed yourself into an environment of coherence. As the text concludes, you discover something remarkable. You spend far less energy searching for your place in the world because your character becomes a place others are grateful to find.
Your character becomes a place. That is a masterpiece of a thought. You stop searching for the destination, and you do the work of becoming the destination.
You become the coherent city.
I want to pull all of this together now to sort of synthesize this journey we've been on. We started by dismantling the idea that relationships are just machines to be fixed. We recognized the profound biological truth of the Plex, that from cells to galaxies, life demands connection and chronic isolation is a disease against our own nature.
We then shifted our gaze inward, recognizing the city within. We realized that every single person we encounter is a vast, unseen metropolis of joy and trauma, which forces us to replace simple pity with the gentle awe of true compassion.
We tackled the chaos of relational topology, learning the liberating truth that harmony isn't sameness. We don't need everyone to agree with us. We just need the ordered diversity of the orchestra. The hospital and the power plant finding a way to integrate.
And we translated that theory into the daily mud of actual construction, the building stones of listening before speaking to survey the land, keeping promises to reinforce trust, and doing the delicate work of repairing broken bridges, correcting without the destructive blast of humiliation.
We realize that every single word lays a brick. We're constantly building our architectural legacy, a legacy measured not by the monuments we own, but by the harbors we steward.
Culminating in the ultimate maturity, forgetting the PR campaign of the ego, abandoning the need to be admired, and dedicating our infrastructure to becoming profoundly useful, becoming a place where others flourish.
It is a complete paradigm shift. And the source text ends with this beautiful, almost poetic benediction. It's a wish for structural integrity that I want to read directly. May your gates welcome wisdom. May your harbors remain open to the weary. May your gardens bear fruit long after you're gone.
It is handing the blueprints back to us, because ultimately, as the text reminds us in its final lines, every city is built twice.
First in the mind, and then through the lives we choose to shape.
The invisible blueprint always precedes the visible building.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought for you to take into your day, to mull over long after this conversation ends. If it is true that every city is built twice, first in the mind, then in reality, take a long, hard, brutally honest look at the blueprints you are quietly drafting in your mind right now. When you think about that difficult coworker you have to see tomorrow, or the estranged family member you haven't spoken to in years, or even your own spouse. Oh, wait, let me rephrase that. When you look at the architectural plans in your head regarding those people, what do you see? Are you quietly drafting blueprints for massive walls, designed to keep them out and protect your own isolation? Or are you doing the agonizing, courageous, profoundly necessary work of drafting blueprints for bridges?
The architecture of your life and the legacy of your city is entirely in your hands.
The construction starts the moment you finish listening. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Go out there, build well, and walk in peace.